the setting's going to be spring of 1865. So I was born in Hodgkinsville, Kentucky. My father was an abolitionist, didn't believe in slavery, and an abolitionist would fight slavery whichever way they could, within the law or sometimes outside the law. Well, my sister Sarah and I, we was reaching the age of 10, 11, 12 years old, and our father didn't want us growing up in a slave state. So he moved the family into the state of Indiana. And shortly after we arrived in Indiana, my mother fell ill with the snake root sickness. That was the old cow that had eaten the snake root plant, contaminated the milk. My mother drank the milk and got sick. And she died. Well, my father went back to Kentucky, and there was a widow lady there by the name of Sarah Bush Johnson that he had knew about, and so they was married, and she became a stepmother, and she still lives today. She lives on a farm back in Charleston, Illinois, the farm that I bought for her before we left, so she knew that she would always have a place to live. And so from Indiana, we moved into Illinois, and I went into a small settlement down near Springfield called New Salem. I'm about 21 years old. Now at age 21, by leaving the slave state of Kentucky, the only Negroes that I saw was free. I not really saw anyone enslaved in Indiana or Illinois. So at age 21, my feelings towards the African or the Negro was that they was not equal to the white man. And definitely no Negro was equal to me. That was my feelings towards the African race. And so there in New Salem, some friends of mine, we decided we wanted to take a flat-bottom boat and load some supplies for trade and go down to New Orleans. Well, we did that, and when we got down to New Orleans, that's the first time I saw a big city like that, a big port. So we unloaded our supplies, did our trade, and we went into New Orleans to look at the city, as young men would do. And we stumbled upon the slave markets there in New Orleans. And for the first time in my life, I saw humans being sold by other humans. I saw the Africans being sold into slavery, saw families being split apart, children being sold off. And this troubled me greatly. It reminded me back when I was younger of how my father worked me as a boy, and I never received any payment for my labor. And so I remember that. My heart at that moment was softening and sad for what I saw at the slave markets. So we got back to our flat-bottom boat, and we started back up the Mississippi, back into Illinois. And the first night out, we tied our flat-bottom boat to the shoreline to rest that night. And while we was asleep, our boat was raided by pirates. They was freed black men. And when they came aboard our boat, in my life I felt was threatened. Some of our property, our personal property, was stolen by these freed black men. And so now I remember in this short trip of what I saw in New Orleans at the slave market, and now the freed blacks threatening my life. So I'm still juggling my feelings towards the black race. So I get back to New Salem, and there in New Salem I take the bar exam. I lived in New Salem about 8 years, and I took the bar exam and I passed and I became a lawyer. I only had, and I still only have, 6 months of public school. The rest of my education I had learned on my own with the assistance of my mother, my stepmother, ministers, and Mentor Graham there at New Salem, and helped me with my education. So I am now an attorney at law. I go into Springfield to start practicing law, and I start courting a young lady by the name of Mary Potter.
Abraham, I would like to say something at this point in time, please.
Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Lincoln, she still hasn't changed all these years. Go ahead.
I would like to tell you that I was also born in Kentucky. I was born in Lexington, and I was born into a wealthy family, and we owned slaves. I lived there in Lexington until I was 19 before I moved to Illinois. The house that I lived in was across the street from a slave market, and so I grew up with the slave auctions across the street from me. I still remember the hollering and the screaming and the crying and the moaning from mothers being torn away from their children when they were sold away from them. I remember the hollering and the screaming when husbands and wives were sold to separate slave masters. It bothered me, but it was the times that I was living in, and this was an acceptable part of our society. The slaves in our household, we took very good care of them. They had a nice small log cabin with a nice dirt floor out and back. They had decent food. We made sure that they had clothing that was adequate for them, because they were in our home, so we wanted them to look not scruffy. We kept the slaves. When my father passed away, he was still owning slaves. By then, Mr. Lincoln and I, we were married, and he was a lawyer, obviously. So he went back to Lexington to settle my father's estate. And part of the settlement of the estate was he freed all of the slaves that my father owned, which that was the proper thing for him to do. Several years ago, still talking about slavery, several years ago, probably about 1862, I believe it was, he was still thinking about slavery, and he was talking about emancipating the slaves. And again, I kept remembering the hollering and everything, and kept nudging him, saying, yes, do it, do it. Kept pushing him. And he finally came up with an emancipation by proclamation to free the slaves. And I was very proud of him, and I'm still very proud of him yet today. Mr. Lincoln is not speaking yet.
Thank you, Mrs. Lincoln. That's the way she is. She just interrupts me. But anyway, thank you. So there in Springfield, I'm starting to come a little ways on the issue of slavery and the Negroes. And so I run for the United States Senate against Stephen A. Douglas, the man that courted Mary Todd. Well, as senators, we debated throughout the state of Illinois. Even though we were not going to be elected by the people, we was going to be appointed by the Illinois legislature, because that's the way it was. We was not elected, we was appointed by the legislature. But we still had the debate so the legislatures would know how we worked. So we traveled all over Illinois and we did debates. And we talked on various issues from states' rights, immigration, postal service, tariffs, and slavery. Now Douglas, I respect. But Mr. Douglas and I differed on the issue of slavery. New territories west of Mississippi wants to become states. My stand on the new territories to come in as statehoods must come in as free states. I have now planted my feet. No more expansion of slavery in the United States. Mr. Douglas believed that the new territories coming as new states should be able to be either free or slave, their choice. That was the major difference between Mr. Douglas and me during this debate. Well, the legislatures, when the votes was counted, Mr. Douglas was the new United States Senator from Illinois, and I lost. Well, through it all, I get the nomination for President of the United States, and I'm elected. And shortly after I was elected, Civil War is coming. I have campaigned, I have talked more than once. And I have said, because I am trying to get volunteers, men to come in and join the Army and Navy to help fight the rebellion. So I have said, if my goal was to preserve the Union, so if I must free some of the slaves to preserve the Union, I will free some of the slaves. If I must free all the slaves to preserve the Union, I will free all the slaves. And if I must free no slaves to preserve the Union, I will free no slaves.